Well, good afternoon and welcome to this second part of our conference on nature and naturalism. Let me introduce our next speaker, Mario de Caro, who teaches at Roma Tre University and the Tufts University as a visiting professor. He is a Fulbright Fellow at Harvard University as a visiting scholar at MIT. He is Vice President of the Consulta Nazionale di Filosofia, past President of the Italian Society of Analytic Philosophy, and Associate Editor of the Journal of the American Philosophical Association. He has edited 20 collections and authored 3 books and more than 100 scientific articles and in 6 languages. I think that our students know Professor De Caro very well because we read his work every year on freedom and moral responsibility. And his works also are about moral philosophy, metaphysics, metaphilosophy, and history of Eastern modern thought. The title of the paper today is Naturalism and Realism.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Caruana for the nice invitation. It's my first time at the Gregoriana. That is actually the only university in Rome I haven't been before for a talk, so I'm very happy finally to be here. Also, I'm happy to speak after Lynn Baker, that is one of the philosophers I respect the most, and I feel very sympathetic. And actually, I think my views are even closer to hers than she thinks. So if I'm very near to her, so my view could be called near naturalism. So today I will argue that the best form of naturalism has to be declined as a form of pluralistic realism, and I will say something about that because there are liberal naturalists like myself that actually are not realists. They tend to be quietist about metaphysics and about they're very Wittgensteinian, like David MacArthur. I am more on the realistic front, like Lynn in some respects. Okay, so let's set the stage for the discussion. Here, we have to answer, is naturalism a feasible metaphilosophy? Well, the answer is, it has to be straightforward. It depends. It depends on what kind of naturalism you talk about. I don't think that the forms of scientific naturalism that Lynn has presented should be adopted as a metaphilosophy, just because they are very narrow and they leave out a lot of things we really care about. So on this, I will quickly repeat some things that Lynn has said, with some slight differences, but I think we really overlap a lot on this. I think on the market now, considering the issue of naturalism, we can present 3 metaphilosophies. One is anti-naturalism. Another one is strict naturalism. I call it strict naturalism because sometimes when I use the term liberal naturalism, I'm attacked because they say, oh, you are against science, just because the other one is scientific naturalism. If you refuse that, you're against science. I'm not. So in this lecture, I will use the word strict naturalist for the reductionist and the eliminativist forms of naturalism. And then my own view, that is liberal naturalism. Lynn would be in between liberal naturalism and something else, perhaps not anti-naturalist, but because she's a quietist about supernaturalism. Okay, so let's present strict naturalism. I will go a little deeper, perhaps, on this. So the first liberal scientific naturalism has 3 tenets. The first one, scientific naturalism has 3 tenets. The first is ontological. As Lynn said, according to this view, reality consists of nothing more than the entities to which the successful explanations of natural sciences commit us. So nothing else can be accepted. If there is something else that we think exists, it has to be reducible to those entities, okay? So, to make examples, colors do not exist. Chairs exist, but only because they are agglomerates of atoms. And so are human beings. Then there is an epistemological tenet. Scientific inquiry is our only genuine source of knowledge. Sometimes it is only, where scientific means only what the natural sciences tell us about, and even only physics. This is physicalism, the most restrictive naturalistic view. Is a very strict form of scientific naturalism, physicalism. But anyway, in general, people who are called scientific or strict naturalists believe that scientific inquiry is our only genuine source of knowledge. All other alleged forms of knowledge, like a priori knowledge, phenomenological knowledge, and introspection are either reducible in principle to scientific knowledge or illegitimate. And there is a corollarium here, and it's a metaphilosophical tenet. Philosophy must be continuous with science as to its content, methods, and purposes. That seems to be a very strict constraint on philosophy, but actually is very popular, especially in North America nowadays. It's very popular also because it has noble fathers like Quine. So Quine, for example, wrote, "Nothing happens in the world, nor the..." Sorry, I have to put glasses at some point. "Not the flutter of the eyelid, not the flicker of a thought, without some redistribution of microphysical states." And then, full coverage in this sense is the very business of physics and only of physics. So only physics, and probably only microphysics, tells us what the world consists on, what is in the world, what is real. And his ontological criterion famously says that we should accept in our ontology the entities that we are acceptable for physics. For our best theories, where best theories for him mean physics. So only physics tell us what the world consists in and what really exists. More articulated is the view by another great philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars. That actually, the interesting thing is that Sellars has this idea, takes this idea from Husserl, takes the structure of his view from Husserl, and then he takes the opposite view. He structures the discourse, the philosophical discourse, like Husserl. There is one image that is the common sense image, and then there is something, and then there is the scientific image that comes out of the first. But differently from Husserl, he says that only the scientific image is the real one, gives us the truth. So he says, Marvin Faber, that he was Sellars' teacher, and he was a student of Husserl. Marvin Faber introduced me to Husserl, and his combination of utter respect for the structure of Husserl's thought with the equally firm conviction that this structure could be given a naturalistic interpretation was undoubtedly a key influence on my own subsequent philosophical strategy. So, is Husserl taken in the opposite side? I'm stressing this point because Husserl will come back later. So what does Sellars say? That's a famous quotation. "Speaking as a philosopher, I'm quite prepared to say that the common sense world of physical objects in space and time..." Can I ask why every 15 minutes? What happens? You have very short classes here. Okay. "Speaking as a philosopher, I'm quite prepared to say that the common sense world of physical objects in space and time is unreal. That is, that there are no such things. There are no chairs. There are no mountains. There are no people." Okay? Speaking as a philosopher, not as a scientist, speaking as a philosopher. Or, to put it less paradoxically, that in the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, or what is that it is, and what is not that it is not. That's a new Protagorean way of putting the task of philosophy and the constraint of philosophy, constraints that are on philosophy. Philosophy as only to refer to science, as science tells us what exists, and science is practically microphysics. Okay? So there are no physical objects in space and time. This is very drastic, right? It's not that there are no values, no souls. That's already much. But no, there are no physical objects in space and time. And this is one of the major American philosophers, very influential. And now, Lynn correctly mentioned another one of, this is John Searle, who wrote, according to Searle, this is the most important question of philosophy nowadays. How can we square a conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning-creating, free, rational, etc. agents with a universe that consists entirely of mindless, meaningless, unfree, non-rational brute physical particles? As Lynn was saying, for Searle there are only physical particles, subatomic particles, so the mystery is, what about all the other things? Okay? And for Searle, we have to explain how the other things can exist, considering that the only things that exist really is the subatomic world. This is, I think it's very honest in the way he puts it, but I would take it more as a reduction of it, this view, than as a serious philosophical program, because this gives a lot of problems. And this is a form of new foundationalism. Notice that, because everything has to start from microphysics. Okay, so there are, of course, Lynn already mentioned some of the criticism. Let me summarize. This is a way of putting the problem that strict or scientific nationalism faces. And this is a quotation by one of my favorite philosophers nowadays. This is Tyler Birch. And he wrote some years ago, but still I will still subscribe to that. The flood of projects that attempt to fit mental causation or mental ontology into a naturalistic picture of the world strike me as having more in common with political or religious ideology than with a philosophy that maintains perspective on the difference between what is known and what is speculated. So he's saying, all this idea that people really hold this view, there are only atoms, subatomic particles. Let's try to derive everything from them. And then they find this impossible, more or less, but they keep going. Like really some ideological, some people in politics will always go on with their own views, even if it's obviously absurd. This is called, generally, I don't remember if it was me and Deb MacArthur's Hugh Price that first called it the placement problem. And this is it. What should one think about the features of the common sense view of the world that do not fit into the scientific world, the scientific view? This is what Searle says, right? And look, there is an infinity, a large amount of problems here. Free will, for example. There are all these attempts to prove that free will doesn't exist, or free will is, explainable with the notions of the natural sciences. And they are these attempts are frankly ridiculous often. Really, they don't, first, they don't reduce, it's impossible to reduce a category like free will and categories that are intrinsically normative, because no one knows how to reduce normative categories to the descriptive categories of the social sciences, or the natural sciences. But besides that, there are also terrible consequences. There are people nowadays that argue this way. Big, very important philosophers. Some is also a friend of ours, like Dirk Pereboom. They say this. So we know now from science that free will does not exist. So moral responsibility does not exist. So merit, desert, do not exist. So the idea that we can punish someone because this person deserves punishment, so the idea of retribution, do not exist. So we should go on with a purely utilitarian view of free will and responsibility and punishment. And this immediately opens the space for terrible practices like the scapegoat. Because scapegoat, the idea that you punish an innocent people because this is useful from a purely utilitarian point of view can be justified. And remember, they give up all the other conceptual resources. They only want resources like what is useful. And the consequences are atrocious. So this is about free will. But also moral and normative phenomena. There are a lot of attempts to prove that they can be reducible, like what Dick Boyd tries to do, to natural phenomena. And that's frankly doesn't work. Or even to say that they are, as Lynn was saying, Rosenberg is one, or Mackey famously, that moral phenomena are just illusions. They are false. When we say that torturing a child is wrong, we are not really something that is true, cannot be true, according to these people. No normative statement could be true, okay? This is their view. I take it as a reduction, but they don't feel that way. They think that, you know, we express our emotions. I think we express something that is true, but this is my own point of view. Self-consciousness, we could add also the first person point of view. Phenomenological properties, they cannot account for those, of course. That's the famous hard problem of consciousness. Collective intentionality, that's an interesting phenomenon that's discussed nowadays. How can you reduce to naturalist categories, scientific categories, and notions like what the people want? This is something that even Searle discusses a lot. This comes from Barry Smith, a common friend, that says, try to express the notion of financial debts by only using the concept of the natural sciences. Try to do that. It's frankly impossible. Mathematical truths that even Quine, who was, you know, a stubborn physicalist, had to admit that there is a sense in which mathematical truths are objective and mathematical entities do exist. So he accepted the existence of abstract entities. So his physicalism had a gap in some sense, has some hole somewhere that he didn't like to talk very much. But that's a common. People tend to accept it. They start by saying only what physics says that exists we should accept, and they accept the existence of numbers. Some people, like Hartreefield or Penelope Mendy, try to prove that we can give up the idea that numbers are real and that mathematical truths exist, but that's frankly it's a very heavy position to accept. So, for example, Hartreefield wrote that 2 + 2 is 4 is as true as the fact that Oliver Twist was born in London. That it means is false. So 2 + 2 for him is 4 is false because he doesn't believe that there can be truth about abstract entities because only the concrete entities of physics exist. That's where these views can arrive, right? And so notice that, so this form of strict or scientific naturalism encompasses an imperialistic version of scientific realism. This is something that I'm going to stress. I am a scientific realist. I believe that physics talks about a real part of the world, but I don't believe that the only form of reality is what physics tell us about. So let's first, before saying why I am a physical realist, I'll tell you why, or a scientific realist, I'll tell you why we should refuse the imperialistic interpretation of scientific realism. So a simple way of proving this is to mention some common realists. This is a list of philosophers that have accepted the existence of the entities that common sense accept. Okay? Remember what I told you before, right? I told you the Seller said there are no things that we believe all common sense objects do not exist. There are no, even more, there are no objects in space and time. And this philosopher, of course, believed the opposite. There are objects in space and time. And any philosophical theory that denies that is doomed. That's their view. And I think they are right on this. So what are the tenets of common sense realism, a view that I accept? First, apart from special cases, perception gives us access to the external world as it really is. Remember what Seller said. Objects in space and time do not exist. I don't believe that. I believe that perception gives us the access as a part of the real world. Observable objects really have the primary and secondary properties that on the basis of perception we tend to attribute to them. So I would deny that there is no sense in which we can say that colors are real or that middle-sized objects exist. And then middle-sized objects have properties that are not identical to whatever microphysical properties constitute them. Okay? So of course, this object is constituted by atoms. I don't think it's identical to the combination of atoms that constitute it, simply because it has also other properties. No description of a middle-sized object that only mentions its physical properties could account for their qualitative, functional, axiological or aesthetic properties. So if you say, oh, this chair is elegant or is comfortable, I'm thinking there is a way of saying this by using the concepts of physics or even some other natural sciences. And the same is for, of course, more importantly, for describing a situation and morally connotated. When I say this person is suffering, I should help that person, this is something that cannot be translated in a scientific vocabulary. So this is Husserl. That's why I mentioned Husserl before. This is what Husserl said in Crisis, or Crisis, as Germans tend to say. And I think that this is a correct presentation of what happened after the Galilean revolution. He said, Galileo performed a surreptitious, Galilean science, let's say, performed a surreptitious substitution of the substructured, let's say, that's a translator, the mathematically structured world of idealities for the only real world, which is actually given through perception, which is ever experienceable, our everyday life world. So he says, Galilean science was taken as the only description of reality, okay? So no primary quality, no secondary qualities were part of reality anymore, for example. No values, no meanings. And so the only real world for Husserl was the one that we perceive through the senses. Of course, then there is the phenomenological reduction. But basically, what we perceive is real. And then he says, this substitution was promptly passed on to his successors, the physicists of all succeeding centuries. So people started to think that the only real world is the physical world. And so this is what Husserl says. For him, the only real world is the life world, the world of human experience, the opposite of Seller's. In this world, value and meaning are real, and secondary qualities do belong to the external objects in which we would commonsensically locate them. The life world is the forgotten meaning fundament of natural science. That is, a genealogical and conceptual fundament. Okay, so science depends conceptually and genealogically from the life world, but more scientific, and that's crucial, scientific concepts are mere idealizations with practical purposes, such as measurement and prediction, but do not refer to any unobservable reality. So the point is, starting from a point that I share, it's important, so the reality of the common sense world, Husserl goes too far by saying that science does not talk about the real world at all. So when science talks about unobservable objects like atoms, it's not telling us what exists really. These are only, he has was common in his own time, think about scientists like Poincaré or Lioham, was common to be anti-realistic about science, instrumentalistic, conventionalistic, and so on. Certainly Husserl was. And so he refused the idea that science, when he is disjunct from common sense, tell us the truth about the world. But you would say, okay, that's Husserl, 100 years ago almost. So who cares? No, you should care because there is also, this is a great philosopher of science, one of the best of this, still alive, Bas van Fraassen, who has this view that he calls constructive empiricism that goes in the same direction of Husserl. Notice only constructive empiricism. That's a very different form of empiricism from Locke or Berkeley or Hume empiricism. Because Locke, Hume, and Berkeley were strongly anti-realist about the common sense world as well. Okay? For them, we only know about the perceptions. We don't know anything about the external world. Okay? Instead, what Van Fraassen means, like Husserl, that we can really know the external world as it is. And it is very similar to what the common sense tells us about. So he writes, constructive empiricism is set squarely within a common sense realism that was foreign to much of the empiricist tradition. So he's criticizing Hume here. He's a common sense realist. But then he said, in this light, the common sense basis I assume is language, in which reference is unproblematic to trees and mountains, people and books, So exactly the things that Sellers said do not exist. Things that are in space and time that we perceive through the senses. So he's assuming the existence of the common sense entities. And I'm perfectly happy with that. But then he adds, empirically adequate scientific theories that appeal to unobservable entities may be useful heuristic tools, but are not true descriptions of the world. Again, like in Husserl, he tries to reconcile common sense realism with scientific anti-realism. And here you can see now that we have two opposite views. Quine, Sellers, Searle are scientific realists and anti-common sense realists, whereas Van Frassen and Husserl believe in common sense but deny any legitimacy to scientific ontology, specifically scientific ontology, when science talks about something we cannot perceive. So this is something that Hilary Patton suggested to me, to call this hyper-common sense realism. So the kind of common sense that Husserl and Van Frassen hold. It's a common sense that is common sense about realism, realist about common sense, anti-realist about science. And so this is, I'm summarizing with my own words, these views. When natural sciences appeal to unobservable entities and properties, they go wildly beyond what perception tells us about the external world. So an anti-realistic attitude should be assumed towards the unobservable entities posited by the natural sciences, such as electrons, radiations, or black holes. These are things that we cannot say that exist, okay? Electrons, radiations, black holes is not something that we can take for granted. Actually, we should say that we should take them for non-existent. They are just instruments, epistemic instruments to make predictions. We don't know anything about the world we do not perceive. Okay, so I'm strongly against the unilaterality of these two views. The scientific view of the world that says that what common sense says is not reality, and the hyper-common sense realist that says that what science tells us about reality is not true. I think we should combine them and be pluralistic in ontology and epistemology. So here is a criticism to common sense realism, to the idea that what science tells us about the world of unobservable entities cannot be true. And this argument comes from my great teacher and friend Hilary Patton. It's called the non-miracles argument. And they very briefly stated the argument goes this way. So people who deny that science describes the world as it is, even when science talks about what we cannot observe, these people have to explain this phenomenon. The phenomenon that science makes predictions so accurate, like what will happen how to go to Mars, how to land to Mars, okay? How to cure an infection, make calculations about astronomical phenomena that are explained by the presence of a black hole. How can we predict this phenomena so well if the theory that predicts this phenomena wasn't true? So when we explain something so accurately that we make incredibly precise predictions with theories, how we can think that this theory is not at least approximately true? Okay? So think about someone who is able to predict what numbers will come out at the lottery. You don't think it's chance. You don't think it's an epistemic miracle. You think that he knows something, right? He knows something. And the same is for science. If we make these predictions, that they are so accurate, and if we made these predictions with a wrong theory, then it would be an epistemic miracle that we guess the result. That's Hilary's argument. He says, science has been increasingly successful in giving explanations and in making predictions about the natural world. A realist interpretation of this success is the only one that does not make it a miracle. So we should accept the idea that science, when describes the subatomic world, the black holes, radiations, is talking about reality. There are some objections to this argument. Let me mention two or three. The first one is the non-miracles argument begs the question, It is a general inference to the best explanation that tries to justify local inferences to the best explanations. What is an inference to the best explanation? It's an invention of an hypothesis, what Peirce called abduction, that explains a lot of phenomena. Okay, hypotheses that explain phenomena that seemed unrelated. Okay, so the idea is you have a lot of inference to the best explanation. Say, okay, this theory has to be true because he explains a lot. And then, according to this objection, the philosopher comes and says, oh, okay, then he has to be that all this theory have to be true. And this is another reference to the best application of the inference to the best explanation. But that's not correct because there is no circularity, or the circularity is not vicious here, because there are two kinds of inferences here. The scientific inference, for example, the inference with which we infer that atoms exist, is different, is causal, and is different in nature from the application of the inference to the best explanations. We talk about all the scientific theories, that is just logical, conceptual. One is causal, the other is a conceptual argument. So it's a different kind of argument, it's not circular. Then one says, okay, but Van Frassen, for example, wouldn't be convinced by the no miracles argument. He says, he says actually, Van Frassen could say, oh, there can always be two different theories that predict the same phenomena. So how can it be? Can they be true at the same time? Not, of course, because they are different. So none is true. But that doesn't work because in the long run, one of these competing theories can be proved more adequate and so more approximately true again. So truth comes back. And then this is an objection that was recently raised by an Irish philosopher. I find it interesting because it's stimulating, but simulatorily wrong. So he writes, inferences to the best explanation. So the idea that, I repeat, you have a lot of phenomena, and then you invent a hypothesis. That gives an explanation for all of them. And they says, and this is exactly what you are doing. You have a lot of scientific theories and invent and apply an inference to the best explanation. Say, okay, the best way of explaining the success of these scientific theories is that they are true or approximately true. But then he says, this is a method that inferences to the best explanation do not play a significant role in the scientific method, since without direct experimental corroboration, theoretical entities remain merely hypothetical for many scientists. So he says, you can have a theory that assumes that, unobservable entities exist, but no one will really accept them until you have some evidence direct evidence that they really exist. And then he adds, quoting Richard Boyd, philosophers should only use scientifically acceptable methods. So conclusion, one cannot use the no miracles argument, which is based on an inference to the best explanation that is not acceptable for scientists, it's not used by scientists, so it should not be used by philosophers. His historical argument is this one. So Einstein accepted the Brownian motion and the existence of atoms in 1908, but no one, the majority of scientists didn't accept atoms until much later, when Perrin in 1908 found a way of giving direct evidence of the existence of the atoms. When atoms were purely a hypothetical entity, just postulated for make better calculations, Ritchie says no one accepted them. You needed evidence. Well, this is interesting, but it's wrong. First of all, he says, look at that. Many scientists don't accept the idea that entities we cannot perceive directly exist until we don't have evidence. But that's many scientists. Others accept them, like Einstein or Boltzmann. Boltzmann killed himself because people made him ridicule because he was believing in atoms, when most people actually were anti-realist about atoms. But does he prove that Boltzmann was wrong because he accepted atoms before evidence came out? So at least Ritchie should say that a vast majority of scientists wouldn't accept the existence of atoms. But that's not true. It's historically false. because there was a substantial minority who accepted them, like Einstein or Boltzmann, before they were proven real through experiments. These are a list of famous scientists who believed in the existence of atoms before Perrin's experiment. Should we say that they use a method that is not scientific? Should we say they were anti-scientific because they were using an inference to the best explanation? So they were accepting the existence of atoms just because with the atomic theories we could predict a lot of things. And then, of course, atomic theories were being accepted for many centuries. For example, Galileo accepted atoms without having the least direct evidence of their existence because they explained the changes in matter states, and Newton accepted them because of his theory about the nature of the light. So scientists have been accepting the existence of atoms for centuries. So in general, inferences to the best explanations, notwithstanding what Ricci says, are very common in science. Neptune was, as most of you, I'm sure, know, Neptune was discovered after some astronomer had calculated that Neptune had to exist because there was some perturbation in the orbit of Saturn. And so they were looking for the existence of Neptune was inferred on the basis of a theory, a pure inference. People believed that Neptune existed because there was a good theory that predicted if Neptune existed, we could explain this strange orbit of Saturn. Galileo became a Copernican, alle Gregoriana, we should note this. Galileo became a Copernican differently, for example, from many fathers of the Collegio Romano that were Archimedean, like Clavio, knew a lot about science, but didn't become Copernican. Why? Because there were not real proof. There was not real direct evidence. The only evidence that Galileo had was an inference to the best explanation. He thought it was much easier to make astronomical predictions if you assume that the Copernican system was correct. He didn't have any other evidence at the beginning. And Darwin, look at this passage by Darwin. I cannot believe that a false theory would explain, as it seems to me that the theory of natural selection does explain, the several large classes of fact described in my book. So what he's saying is, my very easy principle, evolution of the species through natural selection explains a lot unrelated phenomena. Look, he didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know anything about the DNA that makes it possible to transfer to the offsprings of the animals their own features. He was assuming, he was using an inference to the best explanation. And there is a long, spectacular passage. Is there here anyone from the Netherlands? Oh, good, so I can pronounce this name because the pronunciation of this scientist is unbelievable, but Huygens or something like that. Anyway, he's one of the greatest scientists of the scientific revolution. Here I don't have time to mention this, but just it's like an epistemology book nowadays. He lists exactly what the inference to the best explanation is. So he says when you cannot have a deduction, you can still reach almost certainty by using this, by using a system that gives you, establish a probability which is a little short of certainty. And he's talking about the light, right? When the consequences of the assumed principles are in perfect accord with the observed phenomena. So when you make this theory, make good predictions, and they are so precise, you can assume that your hypotheses are true. This is an inference to the best explanation. And then there is something that I really object to, Ricci, when he says that philosophers should only accept anyway methods that are used in science. I don't believe that. So even if the inference of the best explanation wasn't used in science, I think philosophers should be allowed to use it. So my conclusion is that there is no attack on the no-miracles argument, no attack that is effective. The no-miracles argument justifies scientific realism, and then, so I would say scientific realism is justified. There is another reason to be a realist in science that's a little more technical. Nowadays, this is nowadays in philosophy of science. There is a view that is called structural realism. And that's a form of realism that is, I think, very good and so substantially that says that we don't know the intrinsic nature of the unobservable phenomena and entities. So we don't know what an atom is, but we know their structure. So we know their relations. We only know the relations. We know correctly what the relations out there are of these entities. We don't know their own nature. These are two interpretations. One is epistemic structural realism. So we don't know because we are ignorant the structure of these entities. And another one that's fantastic. This is actually the opposite of Leibniz's view, because he says the subatomic entities are not entities. They are only relations. So you remember, according to Leibniz, there are no relations. There are only entities, monads. Here there are only relations, non-entities. Anyway, whatever you accept of these two interpretations, this is a very strong view now in philosophy of science. Remember, 30 years ago, people tended to be anti-realist in philosophy of science, like Kuhn or Feyerabend. Now, most philosophers of physics and biology are realists, the vast majority. They are realists because they have good arguments for being a realist. So now my own view, I will say why I want to reconcile these two forms of realism, and something more about some correction to what Lynn mostly correctly said about me, but with a slight difference. So I think liberal naturalism is the best form of pluralistic realism. I want to be pluralistic about reality. And, it's not any measure of mine. Think about old Aristotle saying that being can be said in many things, in many ways. I think he was right. People tend to forget this. Now, for example, Peter Van Inwagen famously wrote that he cannot understand the idea that being can be said in many ways. There is only way of being. Only one way of being, according to him. I don't believe that. I believe there are ways in which atoms exist, ways in which people exist, in which values exist, and which mathematical entities exist. But let me say more. So I believe in a liberalized ontological tenet. Some real entities exist that are irreducible to, but not incompatible with, the entities that are part of the coverage domain of the science-based ontology. So there are other entities besides the ones accepted by science, even if they are not incompatible with those. And then there is a liberalized epistemological tenet. Some legitimate forms of understanding, like a priori or introspection, are neither reducible to scientific understanding nor incompatible with it. And then a liberalized metaphysical tenet. There are issues in dealing with which philosophy is not continuous with science as to its content, method, and purpose, even if it should not be at odds with it. Let me give you an example. I have time? How much time do we have?
10 minutes.
Okay, yes, that's perfect. So think about this. In ethics, we should ignore science? No. Should we reduce morality or ethics to science? No. I'll give you an example. There are influential philosophical anthropologies in ethics. One comes out of Hobbes, for example, and reaches nowadays many others. The idea that we are intrinsically egoistic. We intrinsically tend to conflict. That's very common, for example, in economics, right? What is the homo economicus? That is the ideal on which traditional and marginalist neoclassic economy is based. The idea that we only perceive our own interest, okay? Because we are all egoists. And these people also think that war, for example, is unavoidable because this is our nature. Well, these views have been empirically falsified. We have a lot of evidence from biology nowadays that we have cooperative, altruistic tendencies inside us when we are born. More, there are experiments about little children, how altruistic they can be with people they do not know, and even about chimps and monkeys, they can be altruistic. So the idea that, having nowadays a conception of morality in which it's assumed that we are naturally egoistic, that's just wrong. We shouldn't start from that. But does this mean that we should explain everything with the sciences? Not at all. Think about this theory. Some people think that morality can be reduced to emotions. There is a great renaissance now of emotivism and other similar forms of ethics. So let's assume that we go out of here today, and I go out and find on the street, I'm by myself, I find on the street a person of another ethnicity that is there, bleeding, dirty, suffering and asking for help. Look, has been proved that very probably my reaction, the first reaction would be fear and disgust. It's dirty, it's of another ethnicity. My first reaction is repulsion for that, normal. But can we talk about ethics in this way? Not at all. Because ethics is the next step when I try to adjudicate if my first reaction is correct or not. I detach critically myself from my reaction and say, I should help that person. I should. I ought to. This is a normative idea that comes from reason, not from the mere sentiments or emotions. That's the ethical stage. The possibility of critically detaching myself from my own emotions. Of course, this state is reinforced by other emotions. I'm happy if I help. I feel better. This is an emotion, but certainly it's not a purely a question of emotions. So this is a way of showing how science can contribute, but also the fact that ethics cannot be reduced to science. Now, some remarks. The first three are metaphysical. Between the features of the macroscopic world and those of the scientific world, there is a relation of global supervenience. The properties of the macroscopic world depend for their existence on the existence of the properties of the scientific world. Supervenience means that nothing can change, for example, in the mental properties, if nothing changes on the physical properties. But that's it. It's not reduction. And also, finally, the objects of the mesoscopic and macroscopic world are constituted, but not identical to the physical feature that constitute them. And then a semantic remark. That's the idea that, okay, I don't have time to explain externalism, but simply the idea that we are causally in touch with the external world. And this helps in explaining why, when we talk about tables, cabbages, and prime ministers, especially prime minister, we are talking about real entities. And physical concepts refer to the structures that compose such objects, okay? And last remarks. One thing that is often forgotten, that science itself doesn't have one method or one ontology. It's very varied inside. There is no unity in science. There is a famous book called The Disunity of Science. So talking about the method of science is wrong. The object of science is wrong. I think there are excellent reasons for a liberalized ontological criterion. So let's be liberal about that. This is something I asked Lynn before. I'm a causal pluralist as well. So I believe here Aristotle helps us again. There are as many causes as B causes are, sometimes is said. So let's assume that a person has a stroke, has a stroke, and we should ask why this person had a stroke. There are many answers. One could be, of course, the blood circulated in a way, but blah, blah, blah. That's a physiological answer. Another one could say, certainly he had a stroke. His family, only his family had strokes, so it's a genetic reason. Another one could say, it's my fault. I gave him so much lasagna last night. I ate 4 dishes of lasagna. Or, the partner could say, was my fault. He asked me to go for a run and I refused and now he dies. It's my fault. All these answers are plausible, correct in their own ways. Which is the right one? There is no right one. It depends on the interest with which we ask the questions, why? There is no privileged answer. If we should find for a reflective equilibrium between the common sense view and the scientific view of the world. As to, before, they also connected with the debate that we had before between Fiona and Lynn. In some sense, liberal naturalism opposes to supernaturalism. When supernaturalism causally pretend to affect the world. For example, I'm against the intelligent design. I don't think that's necessary to explain what happens in the world with evolution. But there are forms of religiosity, faith, and spirituality that I think are compatible with liberal naturalism. We already had this discussion. Perhaps I'm tending to the two worlds. So one question is faith. Another question is what philosophy does. I strongly divide this. It's the old two-truths world of something. So I'm neutral about, as Lynn said, about the possibility of the other one. I just say that when we explain the natural world, or even our world, we shouldn't appeal to the interference of supernatural entities. Doesn't mean that we cannot believe that there are and attribute properties to them. But I don't think this should be part of a description of the world as in the intelligent design theory it's done. That's my view on that. Anyway, I strongly believe that form of pluralism should recommend itself in ontology, epistemology, and also in philosophy. Then I'm tolerant also on that. Thank you very much.